Okay. You ready? Let's do this. You're listening to Explore Magazine's Live the Adventure podcast. This is the podcast that delves deep into the outdoors, will inspire, inform, and get you stoked to explore. And I'm your host, David Webb. Welcome to episode 25 of Explore Magazine's Live the Adventure podcast. I'm your host, David Webb. Travel is back. After an unprecedented and long hiatus, we are once again becoming a nation of tourists. But what has changed? What are we looking for? Is it just more of the same? Or have we grown to better appreciate the act of tourism, the act of connection with a new land or a new culture, and the act of escaping one's everyday life? I think so. And this is the nature of transformational travel. Travel that is more than simply time off work, but travel that offers a rich experience and facilitates a deep connection between guest and host. Today, my guests agree. I'm stoked to welcome Mike Willie, owner of Seawolf Adventures on Vancouver Island, and Brenda Baptiste, chair of Indigenous Tourism BC. Brenda's been here before, in 2020. Mike's a first-timer. Both have a lot to say about Indigenous tourism and how the act of hosting and being a guest can forge cultural connections and even play a part in reconciliation. And as this podcast goes live on April 20th, 2 days before Earth Day, we're going to discuss the connection there as well. Let's talk transformational travel with Mike and Brenda. All right, Brenda Baptiste and Mike Willie, thank you so much for joining me. How are you both doing today?
Happy that spring is finally here.
Spring is sprung. And Mike, how is spring in your neck of the woods, northern Vancouver Island?
Doing well. I'm happy to be here and looking forward to the upcoming season.
Absolutely. So Brenda, you are the chair of Indigenous Tourism BC. I wonder if you could just take a minute to let our listeners know what that is. What is Indigenous Tourism BC and what's your role there?
Indigenous Tourism BC is one of the oldest Indigenous tourism organizations in Canada. And it was actually one of the first Indigenous tourism organizations in Canada as well. So we've been around for over 25 years. I am the chair. We have over 400 Indigenous stakeholders throughout the province, and that's growing. It's growing every day, every week. And it's actually the fastest growing sector of the tourism industry in this province. And so essentially our stakeholders are, we have golf courses, retail spaces, cultural centers, restaurants, and anything that's related to indigenous cultural experience. And whether that's a cultural experience or whether that's a culinary experience or whale watching. One of the amazing things about this province is that out of 600 nations across Canada, 200 First Nation communities actually reside here in BC, and they're home to some of the most pristine, beautiful areas of the province. And so the experience is so diverse in terms of where people are living and the landscapes that you can go and experience, but all of the cultures are very different as well. So you can go throughout the province and experience very different types of Indigenous cultures. So we're very lucky and we're very rich here in this province for Indigenous experiences. And Mike's got a great example of an experience that is transformative for our visitors, because hosting is such an important responsibility that we have as First Nations.
Yeah, Mike, so you are one of the stakeholders, right, of ITBC, and you are the owner of Seawolf Adventures out of Port McNeill on northern Vancouver Island. I wonder if you could tell us what you're doing up there and how you fit into the ITBC ecosystem.
Yeah, so we're very happy and proud to be in Indigenous tourism and to work with ITBC. ITBC, as Brenda said, has been around for such a long time that businesses like mine feel confident and safe when we're part of organizations like that. I did get a chance to work with Brenda. I sat on the board of ITBC for a bit. But getting back to Seawolf, it was all about reconnection. And when I started it wasn't even going to be a tourism company. It was basically going to be a water taxi, something to get me into the territory. My mom was still living in Kinkham Inlet, which is the most remote community we have, only accessible by boat or plane. How can I get in there, see my family, reconnect to where I grew up. So it was going to be a water taxi service. And then somebody put me in touch with ITBC, or it was Aboriginal Tourism BC then, with Paula, and then it just kind of grew from there. You should get into tourism, and so I tested it out. I brought a couple of people on. It was on a water taxi. I want to spend some time with these people. Just show them a bit of history, tell them a bit of history, show them a bit of bring them to the Umista, show them around. And Umista is a cultural center. It's a museum. And that's how it started. They loved it. So I knew right away that I was onto something. And then I coupled like the cultural tours with the real wildlife viewing. So we got into grizzly bear viewing a couple of years later after we started. And once we did that, that really got us into the other parts of the territory that we don't access anymore, and we never accessed for such a long time. And to bring our youth in there and teach them about the history and train them to be bear guides, it's just been transformative for them. And I've watched many of our workers just kind of blossom. If they didn't know how to talk, well, within a few tours, they're starting to talk. They're starting to come out of their shell, right? And that's what I like to see. Gives them the confidence that they need.
I'm from Vancouver Island originally, so I have a good idea of where you're set, but I wonder if you could paint a picture to our listeners of what your territory, where you are up there, what it offers, what it looks like, what is the feeling, and what people could expect if they went up and took a tour with you.
Oh yeah, so in the morning we start out at 7:00 in the morning, and we leave Port McNeill, which is the northern tip of Vancouver Island. There are no grizzly bears that we can watch on Vancouver Island, so we do have to go to the mainland. So we chart our way across through Blackfish Sound, through the Broughton Archipelago, which is just abundant with wildlife already, right? So sometimes before we even hit the bear viewing grounds, we're already into orcas, we're already into dolphins, we're into humpback whales, sea lions, eagles, porpoises. And it's an all-in-one kind of adventure that you could take. So then we go up to the fjords, maybe I'd say about 30 nautical miles up the fjord into a place called Giu or Chaquikin. So we have multiple places where we go, and we view bears for at least 3 hours. When we started, we were going to Chaquikin, which is Thompson Sound, and we didn't use platforms there. It was just right on the ground with the bears. Sometimes they get 20 feet away from you, bring a salmon right up in front of you. The feeling that you have, because you get to know these bears over the years, right? You get to watch them when they're cubs, and you watch them every year. They're growing bigger and bigger and bigger, and now they're adults. So we have names for the bears. We see them every year. So it's like we're working with them. We work with the grizzlies. So that was a really life-changing experience, not only for me or my guides, but our guests as well. We're on the southern part of the Great Bear Rainforest, and that's how we market our trip. The southern part of the Great Bear Rainforest kind of just gives a geographic location or area within BC for the international travelers.
Yeah, I know it's the Great Bear Rainforest definitely has a wonderful reputation with international and domestic travelers. Brenda and Mike, you mentioned your guests and the transformative nature of this travel. And Brenda, you were earlier talked about the diversity of offerings around the province. I wonder if Brenda, you could speak to who are the guests? Who do Indigenous tourism operators see? Who is attracted to this experience?
Well, certainly with COVID, things have changed somewhat. Prior to COVID, majority of our guests were international visitors coming through that gateway in Vancouver and then going out to the rest of the province. COVID actually created an opportunity for us to really focus on our domestic market and our regional market in BC. And we were amazed at how many people who live here in this province haven't gone out to explore these amazing parts of our province. Like when Mike was talking about the area that he works in and the experiences that people were having, a lot of people in BC didn't realize that they could do that and that was available to them. I think in the future, we'll continue to have a strong domestic market with Canadians coming to visit BC and certainly regional, people within BC exploring closer to home. We're going to continue to have that messaging out there and just invite people. But also, again, focusing on an international market and trying to get them come back in. And that's been a real challenge. And it's had an impact on businesses like Mike's business, because those international businesses are those international visitors are incredibly important to an experience like his. And so we've been working really hard to advocate to the government to open those borders and start making travel friendly, and also getting that message out that coming to Canada and coming to British Columbia is safe. And that's been a big part of our messaging.
How has Indigenous Tourism BC and balanced also individual communities and areas that perhaps didn't want visitors during the pandemic and wanted to keep themselves safe, balancing that with tourism and cultural experiences, and how did that manifest, and how did that work?
Well, that was a very interesting time at the very beginning of COVID, when we had the lockdown, and nobody really, it was very frightening. Nobody really knew what was going to happen or the extent of it. There was many of our communities, because Indigenous communities, especially the rural and northern communities, don't always have access to the same level of health services that other communities have. And so many of the communities closed off their communities, and those that had tourism businesses closed those businesses. And so it was a real challenge. And so we did two things at the very beginning. The first thing that we did is we worked with our partners, and we actually provided a $5,000 grant to our stakeholders to keep their doors open, their lights on, or buy groceries, whatever they needed, because we knew this was going to be a financial hardship. But the other thing is in talking to our stakeholders, they wanted to make sure that their visitors understood why they were closing access to their communities. And so we created a beautiful video. It's called We're All Connected. And
I remember it. Yeah.
That connection that Indigenous people have to their land, and that responsibility to take care of not only their own people and their elders, but also our visitors. And that this was going to be a time of healing and self-reflection, and that when it's safe, that we would open up those communities and welcome people back, and it would even be a better experience. The other thing is that during that time, we met with the stakeholders. We were actually meeting with them at one point every week through Zoom, and just some of the stories we were hearing were just heartbreaking, because these businesses were in such dire straits. But at the same time, we started doing some capacity building training around how do you do simple things like using your smartphone to actually create a promotional video for your business. How do you and providing training for your staff, and also that cultural training. Now is the time to actually get your knowledge keepers together with your youth. Mike talked about the changes that he saw, the transformation that he saw with his guides. This is the amazing thing about Indigenous tourism, is that it's the only sector that does not take anything away from the natural resources. As a matter of fact, it's built on those principles of stewardship and respect and sharing and building cultural knowledge within the communities. And so we've used that time to really promote that and start getting that cultural knowledge and getting those knowledge keepers and youth together within the communities to be able to build that sense of identity for our youth, so that they can share who they were and who they are as Indigenous people to our visitors.
That's really interesting. Mike, you touched on that a minute ago too, and I wanted to circle back to that concept of what I found really interesting about what you said is there's the idea of the guests coming up there, and maybe they have an expectation of I want to see a grizzly bear, and then they get more than that. They get this connection, they get these stories. But what is really interesting to me is how you said that your staff, yourself, you actually were able to transform at this time too, and see transformation within your staff as they learned more about themselves and learned more about their connections. So I wonder if you could just talk about what type of specific growth and transformations you saw within yourself and within your team members during the years you've been in operation, and how that's been a big benefit to you.
First and foremost, I reconnecting to our territories. I mean, there is a set story to that. A lot of our remote communities, adjacent communities are abandoned now. They lay abandoned because of the residential school in that era. And, when the kids were taken out of those communities, the parents just moved away. Or if you didn't want your child to go to residential school, well, you couldn't live on reserve. You had to move off the reserve. So a lot of the families moved to Vancouver, Campbell River, Victoria. So there's that piece of it, right? So now we're depopulating out of our territory. So that's the piece that when we're coming to repopulate, we're going back into the territory, teaching our kids and youth about who they are, where they come from, right? And if they've heard these stories in the schools, in the local band schools, First Nation schools, well, then we get to bring them to the place where this story happened. And so that's what I'm talking about, reconnecting and reawakening that spirit within us, within our own people as guides, as business owners, having a feeling of presence in the territory and ownership. Ownership is a big piece, right? And so if we don't get our kids out into the territory, what do they know that they're fighting for in the future, right? So we want to build that army, right? And we want to bring our people home. And so that's what Indigenous tourism is doing for us in our neck of the woods, is building that capacity, training and employing our people, and hopefully inspiring more of our youth to start up their own Indigenous tourism businesses, right? So now we're creating our own economy within our area, where we don't need to just depend on the federal money that comes into our First Nations. Now we have an independent revenue stream coming from Europe, you know what I mean? Coming from Australia. And so that's building your independency. And that's our goal at Seawolf. And my First Nation is just getting into tourism too. So it's very, very, very exciting.
So are you finding yourself, some of the people you employ, are you training them in a sense? Have they gone off to start businesses on their own? Are they learning the business under you and maybe branching off on their own? Or is that something that's building now? Is that sort of the goal to start with you, and then they can perhaps start another wing, maybe another branch of your business, or maybe their own business? Maybe they go off and start something completely different. Is that what you hope, to just grow it internally like that?
Yes. There is a story. Coyote Nelson started, he was right at the very inception of Seawolf Adventures. He was with me. We tackled Seawolf Adventures together, and he was a guide. And now, he saw the importance of having presence in the territory. And we're talking remote places, only boat access, right? Where there's no roads over where I'm talking about. Now he has Nawalunk Healing Society, right? And now it's a social enterprise that he's aiming for. And it went from putting cabins into the territory to a multi-million-dollar facility through philanthropy, right? And so he's doing such great work. And it's all based around the health and wellness of our people.
Like you said before, Brenda, that earlier on, before the pandemic, there was a big focus on international travel. So Europe, Asia, I'm sure a lot of big markets there for you. And then that moved during the pandemic to a stronger domestic market. When you're looking at the domestic market, are you finding stronger connections being formed? Because they are the people who, like myself, who, if I came on a tour with you, Mike, I live here, and I'm going to become more connected to this land that I also live on in a new way. Are you finding that there is a stronger connection because it is a more domestic market right now?
Absolutely. I think that the benefits of Indigenous cultural experiences is that it does transform the way that you look at the place that you live. And I always use the example of when I first moved to Vancouver, because I was raised in rural Okanagan, and I was very homesick. And so it was the first time I'd moved to the big city, and I was very homesick. And one of the Squamish chiefs brought me on a tour of downtown Vancouver and showed me where the clam beds were, where they did ceremony. Like, it's all paved over now. It's a modern city. But he pointed out all of these unique, special places that the three nations used throughout the city. And I immediately felt connected and continue to feel connected to the city of Vancouver. It transformed the way I looked at that place that I was living and created a relationship that I hadn't had before. I felt very disconnected when I first got there, and now I'm very much connected. And I think speaking broadly as a province, one of the most important things about Indigenous tourism and Indigenous cultural experiences is that our vision is to truly transform the identity of British Columbia. And Mike talked about this, that there is this story, this Indigenous story of this province. And not only are there difficult truths that, and you know this, we've talked about the residential school and the discovery of the 215, which were incredibly traumatic to our communities, but also traumatic to the all of the people in Canada and in BC. But it created a dialogue, and it also created a sense that it's time for us to start telling the whole truth, not just the happy stories, but the entire history of this province. But there's also that collaboration between the settlers and the Indigenous populations in this province. And those are the stories that we want to tell as well. We built this province together, the settlers and the Indigenous people. And in the spirit of reconciliation that this provincial government, I'm so proud that our provincial government has made a commitment to the principles of UNDRIP and reconciliation, that now is the time to start telling the true story of British Columbia and how we actually became a province. And I think we can be a leader in Canada to tell that story. We have the opportunity. We've got great leaders like Mike and these experiences that will forever transform and change the perspective of our visitors, especially our regional visitors, people of British Columbia, when they come and experience these.
Mike, just this morning I was doing some research and I watched a short film online called Seawolf, in which you play a major role in. And there was something you said in this film that really stuck with me. And it was about, I'm going to paraphrase you a little bit here, but it was about the people of settler heritage saying admission that, we're not going anywhere. We're here too. And reconciliation is about moving forward together. And I want to know what your thoughts on tourism is. Does tourism play a part in reconciliation from your perspective? Is that a big part of why you're operating, particularly if you're operating to domestic clients? Do you see that as playing a role?
Absolutely. I think reconciliation can mean a lot of things. And really it's how it means to us as First Nations. What needs to happen for us to feel like things have been reconciled, right? Things to feel better. Like right now, reconciliation can happen through business, right? And I formed another company called Coastal Rainforest Safaris with a non-Indigenous person, right? And so now we have native and non-native coming together and doing business together. I feel that could be amplified, even nation, you know what I mean? The corporation, like I think that's reconciliation too, so that we're not just receiving the 1%, 2% of the profits. Now we have a lot of skin in the game, and we're part of this generating revenue, real revenue I'm talking about for our communities. So I believe that tourism can play a role in that. And business in general can play a role in that. And in fact, that was one of the 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation was the business sector.
I know there in the tourism industry, outside of Indigenous tourism, there is a lot of talk about any types of negative things about tourism, about people, taking too much or coming, over tourism, people like going into sensitive areas. How do you combat that and make sure that it stays positive?
You have to have that lever bar, right? You have to be able to close the gate if it's happening too much, right? Because if you travel around the world, you see that some areas are damaged, right? And there's too much tourism going on there, and so we don't want that as nations in our area. So, and I think we're kind of blessed by remoteness as well, right? And it would be challenging and probably in a city to have that leverage bar, but and then you're talking about the impact benefits, right? But where we live, it's remote. Where I grew up in Kinkum, for instance, you have to go up the river on a riverboat. I mean, nobody's getting up the river to the village unless you hire a local to bring you up there. So there's ways you can to where you can do it right and only leave footprints. And that's what we're about. We're not about the volume at all. It's more about low volume. I mean, actually, that's people would rather pay more, we find, to not be on a boat full of like 20 people, 40 people, right? And so when we started, it was 6 people maximum, and then during COVID, it was 8, and now it's 10. Right, but our vessels get bigger so that we could have more room, and I think it's more personable anyway. As an operator, as a guide myself, I like to be really intimate with my guests, right? To really tell the history and be face to face, eye to eye, right? That's how I like it.
Do you see this, Brenda, from all your stakeholders, a similar mentality about guests, about keeping it smaller and more personable and more connective?
I do, and I think it's as an organization, one of the things that we've really worked hard on is, one, acknowledging that all of the nations in this province are sovereign in their territory, and so as an organization, we recognize and respect that sovereignty and support Indigenous tourism operators within that region. But we're also really clear about educating our visitors around the protocols and respecting protocols within those areas, which includes stewardship of the land and not having a big footprint on the land. And you'll find that the other thing about Indigenous tourism is that it's primarily it's got a foundation of Indigenous values and principles, which is really stewardship and about protecting the land and protecting the animals and hosting in a responsible way. But you're in terms of having smaller groups, absolutely. That in order to really create that transformative experience and to look at the perspective of Indigenous people in this province, you really do need to have those smaller groups to be able to create a safe space, to share that knowledge and to answer some questions. And the goal is to create a long-term relationship. And in many of our communities, we also have a responsibility, it's a reciprocal agreement where we provide an experience and host our guests, but our guests have a responsibility as well. And in our culture, we have a responsibility called witnessing, which means that we give them the best experience and involve them in the work that we're doing. And when they go home, whether it's in this province or internationally, their responsibility is to act as a witness for us and to say, I had this amazing experience. But we're also really clear, if they don't have a great experience, they still have that responsibility to be a witness. So it's a wonderful way and a very holistic way of balancing the way we do business. And Mike talked about creating economies, and that was why we first started looking at Indigenous tourism before it was even a thing, is because we recognize there's a lot of poverty. And Indigenous tourism is one of those sectors where you don't need a lot of infrastructure or storefront. And so a lot of the communities could take part in Indigenous tourism and create an economy for their communities. And as part of that, they also shore up the social fabric of the communities because they have to learn about the culture before they can share it. So it turned out to be one of the most amazing sectors to actually work in. And it really does. That's what sets that apart from mainstream tourism, is that there's a much deeper, meaningful way of providing an experience than you do get in a lot of mainstream tourism offerings.
There's so much there. There's so many wonderful parts of this, but what are some key challenges? And I'll throw this out to Mike. What are some key challenges in operating within this framework that you've set up and within these expectations that you've come across? Mike, what do you think?
There were a few earlier on, and maybe with some of the international guests, right? And some of the international guests, like, they just want to see a grizzly, right? And they'd ask, well, what percentage is the tour cultural, and what percentage is wildlife viewing? And we're like, well, we don't do it that way. It's all blended, right? We are the culture, so we're going to talk to you throughout the trip, right, and tell you about our history. And so they weren't really interested. What I'm saying is they weren't really interested in the First Nations cultural part. So what we would do is, we work closely with the competition. We would just that tour is probably better suited for you, and I guess what we try to do to avoid that is really on the front end, really manage those expectations. If you come with us, if you pick up the phone and call us, you already know that you want to come with us, basically, because it's all there on the internet, it's all there on our website. There's no 20% culture, 80% wild. There's not. It's all blended. It's us. We cannot separate wildlife and Indigenous people. Period. Right. And so people learn that it's a different paradigm altogether. Indigenous paradigm is much different than the Western paradigm, which is why they clash a lot. Right. And even our languages are so verb based. And then our elders found it so difficult sometimes to translate into English. And as Brenda was saying, the diversity and the amount of tribes here in British Columbia is such a phenomenon to me. There's 34 different languages, distinct languages here in the province. We hold 2/3 of Canada's First Nations languages here on the coast. That's a separation. That's something that I find very, very fascinating, and and mind-boggling actually to think about it. How did that happen, right? And so I'm into that, that history. That we're here much, much longer than 15,000 years, as the archaeological record says. So, you're kind of butting heads with the Western science and our history, right? And sometimes those things don't match. And so, yeah, I think there are some challenges. Through COVID, it was pretty hard as an Indigenous operator, and I've heard that other Indigenous operators found it hard because the criteria for the banks, it doesn't change. It's still the same, right? It does not take into account our lives and reservation life, and so that's something that I hope that could be looked at and create institutions that really fit us Indigenous people here on the coast.
Yeah, that's interesting. And Brenda, I saw you nodding there. Obviously, our listeners can't see that. But I was wondering, you were saying about the tourism, you don't necessarily need a storefront or something like that. But obviously, I'm on Seawolf's website. You've got some beautiful boats that I can only just fathom a guess at what those things cost, and all the different things that do go into a tourism operator. Does ITBC assist with that? Helping people get up and running in the funding sense, because you do need something, right, to operate.
We do. We advocate for financial resources. And one of the challenges, and Mike touched on this, is that especially if you're an operator on reserve, a lot of the financial and banking regulations don't actually fit. For example, you have no equity if you're on reserve, right? And so you can't borrow against property, for example, because we technically don't own our land. We are still wards of the Crown. And so we can't use that for financing. And so we've been advocating for working with groups like All Nations Trust and Indigenous financial organizations, and having them provide resources for some of the infrastructure that's required for some of the businesses but also other funding sources through federal or provincial funding. Because another challenge that we've got is sometimes mainstream funding resources, especially when we looked at COVID funding. And I sat on the BC task force for the COVID during at the very beginning of COVID to look at how we were going to look at recovery for the tourism industry. And they had funding available for tourism, but we actually advocated to have a separate funding source for Indigenous tourism, because people that have their businesses and reside on reserve could not access those funding resources because they required taxation, they required equity, they required all of these things that we don't have access to. And so we continued to advocate for that, and we'll continue to do that. Some of the other challenges that we had within Indigenous tourism are things like land tenures, government regulatory policy that goes against, traditional land areas that our operators operate from. And so we advocate to look at those policies and how can we actually change some of those policies so that Indigenous operators can continue to operate.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was actually just talking to a heli ski operator a little while ago, and they have tenures, right? That they're allowed to fly in. And it never occurred to me before that you are exploring a traditional territory rather than going in and applying for, this is my area, as per, because I would imagine that people are sharing the same areas. They're not dealing with tenures, right? The different operators are all in the same areas in some cases.
Well, and it is challenged. It's a challenge because very often the tenure holders don't want to allow Indigenous operators within their tenure area. So we have to continue to advocate from a traditional lands perspective for that tribal group to be able to access those lands.
Mike, you have to jump off right now, and Brenda and I will just finish up a few more questions I have. But thank you so much for joining. I know obviously you're very busy and ramping up for the season. So all the best of luck, and thank you for joining me.
Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity, and so great to see you, Brenda. I know you can't see me, but I'm very, very proud of the work that you do, and that you're still with ITBC. It's so awesome.
One of the other things that I wanted to bring up that Mike was talking about was around that one of the other challenges is that loss of cultural and language assets. We've got a very young population. 25% of our population is under the age of 25. And we're losing elders and we're losing speakers. And because Indigenous people, our culture, our knowledge, our history is all embedded in our language, which is an oral tradition. It's an oral language. When you lose speakers, you lose so much of the essence of the values and principles that make us who we are as Okanagan people, for example. And so the great thing about Indigenous tourism is that cultural revitalization is an important part of the work that we do, and looking at how do you create that cultural revitalization and activate that within the community, and how do you build that capacity. But you're never going to catch up with what you've lost, and because of the historical issues around residential school and the incredible loss of culture as a result of things like the residential school and the 60s scoop. They're just things that we're never going to be able to get back. And Mike talked about how our language is very much verb driven.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't heard that before.
Yeah, and English is very much noun driven. Right? So us being able to translate a document or translate promotional materials or even a Chaptique story, which is our teaching story in the Okanagan, translate that from Okanagan into English is very challenging, and you kind of lose the essence of what the meaning of those stories. So those are some of the other challenges aside from COVID and wildfires and flooding.
Yes. There's no shortage of challenges. That's for sure. But you seem to be doing a wonderful job so far. In terms of the language is really interesting to me. Obviously I'm a magazine editor as well. Language in general is very interesting to me. So what are some specifics about how tourism relates to helping educate people about the language, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous? Because you must be involving elders in that in some way. And how do they feel about about the experience in general? Not to generalize, but how has some reactions been from elders who are tasked with this?
Well, it's interesting because we don't look at Indigenous tourism as separate from the language and cultural revitalization, because it's really part of our identities of who we are as Indigenous people. So our elders are connected, and in our cultures, people have roles, right? And one of the roles of our traditional knowledge keepers and our elders is to pass on that important knowledge to the next generation. And so they're meeting their role that around passing on that language and that knowledge. And overall, it's about building up the community. And this is very different from looking at mainstream tourism, right? You may have a non-Indigenous tourism operation like a winery. And you do have a story to tell with that winery, but it's generally about the wine and the grapes and all of those other things. Well, for example, we have Inkami Cellars, which is on the Osage Indian Band Reserve. And the stories that we tell about our winery aren't just about the wine, it's actually about the living culture and the land that the wine is grown on, our connection to that land, and using our language to describe and name those wines, right? So they're so interconnected that we don't consider them as separate. So you've got that social connection and that cultural connection between a tourism operator, which is really just living their lives, right? It's hard for me to explain.
No, I know what you're saying.
Like what Mike is doing is he would be doing this if he didn't have a tourism business, right? Because this is part of who he is, and it feeds his soul and his sense of identity. That's the heart of Indigenous tourism, because you can't separate the business from the individual.
And that probably explains to some degree, like you said earlier on, actually it was before the podcast started, that it was one of, or the fastest growing tourism sector in the province, that the natural fit, that it is inherent among the people doing it, that there was no, they just fit like a glove, for lack of any other term, is really interesting to me.
Well, and the other part of that though is we're finding, COVID did have its benefits, and one of those benefits are that, I sit on a number of tourism industry boards, and across the board, I don't think that people had a great respect for tourism. I really think they took it for granted. And then when COVID hit, people realized that tourism was more than just, having the ability to go to the beach or go on a trip, that there's this well-being and healthy part of every individual that requires these kinds of experiences to actually get a full life, a full meaningful life. And so Indigenous tourism meets that need. And I think people recognize that Indigenous tourism is one of those experiences that forever transforms how you see the world, and it feeds who you are. I've always said that, if you go back, anyone on this earth, if you go back far enough, everyone is Indigenous. We all have that in our background, and we all come from somewhere. And what we have the privilege of doing is reminding people of that, and remind people to look at their own identity and celebrate their own history and their own identity, and the good and the bad. And because that truly is a part of who they are, and that's part of overall well-being.
Before we wrap up, I wanted to talk about one other thing. By the time this podcast airs, it's going to be just about April 22nd, which is Earth Day. And I've been seeing quite a bit of messaging coming out of ITBC about Earth Day this year, and about, what it means to Indigenous tourism. And I wonder if you could just talk about some of the messaging that Indigenous Tourism BC is putting out relating to Earth Day.
One of the important things about messages that we have around Indigenous tourism is around, especially with the discussions around climate change, right? is around stewardship and having that small footprint on the land and being able to preserve what we have for future generations. And that's important to us as Indigenous people. We tend to think in future generations and learn from past generations. And so I think that when it comes to Earth Day, is that celebration that we're here. We've got this wonderful home and this wonderful planet that we're living on, but we have a responsibility to take care of it. And part of that responsibility has to be about learning and educating yourselves in terms of what's important to protect our home. And the way that you can do that is through experiencing Indigenous culture, because it's so inherent in us in terms of stewardship and how to take care of the land for future generations. So we invite our guests to come and explore that with us and learn that and celebrate Earth Day with us, because truly it's one of those days that are very important to the Indigenous culture, right? And it's something that we want to share.
And so if someone wanted to start their learning process, where would they look up Indigenous Tourism BC?
Oh, we've got some great tools. We have indigenousbc.com, which is our website. We also have an app, Indigenous BC app for iPhones. The great thing about that is, one, you can build an itinerary wherever you're going in the province. It'll tell you whose territory you're in, how to say the name of the territory.
That's really cool.
Any protocols that you need to be aware of, and what experiences are within that area. So it allows you to plan your trip. If you're going to Wasuyas and you just want to lay on the beach or whatever, it'll also tell you what Indigenous experiences that you can do on other days, right?
So you could put together it could connect you with operators, but also just give you information for if you're just self-guiding as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The app is really good for that as well.
And that's on the App Store. I'll check that out for sure. I really appreciate your time today. It was a real pleasure to chat and to have you and Mike on the show. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I loved it. And it was really nice to catch up with Mike. I didn't get to see him, but I saw the bear. But it was really nice to hear his voice and know that he's doing really well.
Yeah. It seems like you two have a nice connection. Yeah.
Keep up the good work, David.
Thanks a lot. There's a lot here to talk about and think about. But how we engage with our surroundings, about cultural connections and deep stories of the land we share, about what an Indigenous tourism experience offers and how it differs from a more conventional tourism experience. I hope you enjoyed my chat with Brenda and Mike. I sure did. And I can't wait to check out that new app. Find it on the App Store, search Indigenous BC or link through indigenousbc.com. Also, surf over to seawolfadventures.ca to find out more about Mike's operation. Thanks for tuning in today, and hey, live the adventure.